graduate, each is now 20, undergraduate, graduate. But we want to focus on those who graduated from our undergraduate program. We know those folks who graduate from the graduate programs, we know they engage in research, but now we get to see where our folks who graduated from here went on to masters in different fields and decided to explore something incredibly interesting. We will see that many of them have tied their the research that they're going to share with us directly to Armenia, directly to something that they explored in their undergraduate studies, but something that they really thought was relevant to share. Today's launch, Dr. Hasmi Kalapian is going to introduce our speaker, but the series itself was developed, and I want to thank Drs. Hasmi Kalapian and Drs. Huri Gatarian over there, if you can just wave to everybody, for really thinking that this was an important opportunity for us to share. So thank you to the two of you. Look forward to a monthly gathering of all of us together to hear some really interesting research. And now, Dr. Kalapian, if you would introduce our speaker today, we would be incredibly grateful.
Thank you very much. Dr. Markonyan, I want to say that it is true that Burik and I immediately thought that this is a very worthwhile project, but the initiation came from Dr. Markonyan, and she should get the credit for that. But we immediately thought that this is such a wonderful thing to ensure a continued dialogue between the ongoing students and the past students, so the alumni practically. So it is my pleasure today. I didn't have the pleasure to teach Arpine while she was at AUA, but I had the pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker. I will be brief because I know Arpine wants to talk a little bit about her own path. She also wants to talk about that a little bit. She is a graduate of AUA, as you obviously know. She has an MA in English and Communication, BA in English and Communication, and she recently earned her MA from London School of Economics in Gender, Media, and Culture. And she's now back again. Arpine's research background is so impressive, the amount of research that she's done already, even before getting her MA. You do not see this kind of research even coming out from PhD students, so this is really incredible, the amount of work that she's done on archival research, and she will talk a little bit about that. But what I want to say is that many of us might probably know her from this EVN Reports series on the forgotten pages of history, where she was presenting her research on remarkable Armenian women, and that was kind of exposing new pages of history to many of us that we'd not seen before that. And as a person who's worked in the archives myself, I know how much effort it takes to create a narrative out of very scarce sources that are available on women's history, and so that really makes me appreciate her work even more. So Armenia, the floor is now yours.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for being here. I'm very excited because the last time actually I was speaking from Arkan Gallery, I was talking about my capstone project when I was graduating from AUA. It's really my pleasure to be back here as an alumni, and I'm really thankful to Dr. Markonyan for giving me this opportunity. I'm really thankful to Dr. Huri Gatarian and Dr. Hasmi Kalapian for helping me to prepare for this talk, because as you can see, I'm quite nervous. And I'm really happy to see many familiar faces here. I know that we have lots of students here. That's why initially I thought to talk a little bit, like very briefly, about how I came to be here today, how I became an LSE graduate, and I think that's very important. So AUA has given me really a very high quality education, and always say that because without it, I would not be standing here today, honestly. So when I was, I think, second year student, I was taking a journalism class with Ms. Titizan, who is here. Thank you for being here. And I didn't know what I want to become back then, basically. I was interested in film. I like journalists, but I didn't know if I can be like a pushy journalist and interview people. And then when she founded EVN Report in 2017, I just went to her and I said, "Can I intern for you?" And she likely said yes. So then I actually had a couple of articles written for my course, and she suggested to publish it. And then one day, I actually don't remember how we decided to start writing about Armenian women, and that became an article series, and that became a life path for me because of that series I'm standing here today. So I started researching and finding Armenian women who have been forgotten, whose names I myself did not know. And then I started the article series from the Forgotten Pages of History, and then by doing more and more and more and more and seeing that there's not enough research, I said, okay, I need to do a master's in this topic. I chose gender, media, and culture because I'm partially a journalist, partially a researcher, and that combination is just works fine for me. So thank you, everyone. This is a little bit about my path, and I encourage students not to be afraid to talk to your professors. Always go to them, always talk to them, because it's very, very important. And besides education, the most important thing actually AUA has given me is people, our people, and the network of people I have today. Okay, let me just jump into my presentation today and my topic. So I reassure you that I'm not going to bore you because I find the 1920s Armenia, as tragic as it was, but it was also like a funny country in a way that the content that was developed and the content that was published was quite funny, maybe for the people of today. So, as I say, dear comrades, let's go to the journey to find what Mr. Lenin said, what Hեղափոխական Bartur said, the revolutionary Bartur said, and other funny namely people. Okay. So generally, my thesis explored the process of gender construction through the Soviet Armenian women's magazine Հայաստանի Աշխատավորի, the female worker of Armenia, during the first years of its publication. I specifically chose 5 years because it was not possible to do research for the whole magazine. But before jumping into the actual thesis, I really want to give you a little bit of context what was going on back in 1920s in Armenia and beyond it in Soviet Union. So when Bolsheviks came to power in October 1917, they knew that without the help of women, they just will not be able to succeed in building the world's first socialist state. So they came with new perceptions of gender roles, envisioning an image of a woman who would be free from domestic work, educated, and who would be devoted to the state-building processes because they needed workers and they needed people and they needed people who would produce people for them. So what they did is they immediately passed like many laws granting equal rights to women regarding labor, marriage, divorce, property, voting, and abortion. And they announced that the Soviet state abolished all traces of women's equality. This was back in the 1917, 1918. But the thing was that the problem with socialists was they regarded gender equality and women's equality from the class perspective. They thought that all the roots of inequality were rooted in capitalism rather than it was a man's fault. And that was when in 1920 they realized that just passing laws was not enough to conduct work among women, to emancipate them. And they established the Jeune or the Women's Department, which aimed to introduce women to new family structure, domestic labor, maternity, childcare, and sexual relations. So this department had a special task. It was a party department that aimed to conduct work among women from villages, from countries across Soviet Union, across all nationalities. So what they did with the Jeune, the women's department, to communicate their ideas effectively, they used press, of course, because press was a channel through which they could influence the masses, as we know, communicate with them. And there's a scholar who refers the press network of Soviet Union as the blood circulating system, because without it, they would not be able just to disseminate their ideas. And when Jeune was established, they decided to immediately print women's magazine. Actually, the female worker was being printed long before the 1920s, but then they revolutionized the magazine and fitted it to socialist ideology. So they had 3 magazines: the female communist, Kommunistka, female peasant, Kristyanka, and female workers. So basically for 3, I don't want to say that, but for 3 categories of women. And women's magazine played an immense role in disseminating the Soviet ideas and Soviet notions of the new Soviet woman. And I will briefly tell you who was the new Soviet woman the state was trying to construct. Okay. So scholars agree generally that Women's Magazine had the task of creating the image of new Soviet women. This is specifically in the beginning of 1920s. This new Soviet woman, this citizen, was needed so that the Soviet state could complete the task of its state building process. So who was this woman? So she was, of course, a socialist, a Bolshevik. She shared equal rights with men. She was educated. She was freed from domestic chores. She was a very active member of society and very much devoted to state-building processes. Besides that, she was also like a very good mother, a very good citizen, and someone who would promote the Bolshevik party ideology everywhere. So there was a single model of new Soviet woman actually, because it was repeated throughout the magazines, throughout the magazines of different nationalities. But the thing was that the communists were so smart, they localized the magazines to appeal to women from different nationalities across the whole Soviet Union. And then we come to historical Armenia immediately. So I know that most of us know that the women's movements and women's emancipation had started long before Armenia was Sovietized. At the end of the 19th century, from the middle of the 19th century, we had very brave women starting from Elpis Saretsyan, Zabel Yesayan, Suprit Yusap, Mari Veleryan, forgive me others if I don't remember their names, Ari Galemkerian, who talked about women's emancipation, who thought that it was important for the nation-building processes, and most of their writings emerged during the National Awakening period, the Tsar Tong, when Armenians decided that, oh, we need to take the control of our country. So women's role was very important, and women's participation in public life was very important. But the thing was that, unfortunately, because of the very difficult realities and political realities of the late 19th and 20th century, namely the Armenian genocide, the First World War, and also the failed First Republic, these processes were very slow and they did not actually result in significant changes. They resulted in some changes, but not significantly. And when we think about Soviet Armenia, how it was when it was established, we just need to remember that just before 2 years of its establishment, during the failed republic, it's very sad to say that we had 3 women who were elected to parliament. So Armenia just granted rights to women long before many other European countries. But what was the reality in Soviet Armenia was quite sad and depressive. So, unfortunately, because of the lack of scholarship on early Soviet Armenia and gender studies, it's very difficult to understand what was the actual image of Soviet Armenian women's rights back then. It is possible, but it's very difficult. But there was an Armenian-American scholar, Mary Matosyan, who traveled to Soviet Union in the early, I think, 1930s, and she wrote a book about how Soviet policies were changing Armenia, how it worked, what didn't work, and what were the policies and different kind of processes going on in Soviet Armenia. And she labeled that Armenian society was very conservative and traditional, Soviet Armenian society. Women predominantly from rural areas were not allowed to get an education or were deprived of their rights. Early marriages, marriages to minor, compulsory marriage, abduction of women, and bride purchase were among the traditional influences in Armenia. Unfortunately, there are some things that are still true about Armenia 100 years later. So in 1923, the Communist Party, the Armenian Communist Party, established the local Zhenotdel, the women's department, which aimed to conduct work among Armenian women. So what they did, besides all the meetings they organized, besides all the other political work they did among women, they also established the local version of the Rabotnitsa magazine, the female worker. So what is interesting for me also, what was interesting during the research was, as you saw, there were 3 magazines in Soviet Russia. So one for peasant women, one for political women, yes, the communist women, one for the worker women. But for Armenian women, there was only one, and that was called Հայաստանի աշխատավորի, the female worker of Armenia. So the magazine was published monthly between 1924 and 1941, and between 1958 and 1998, which is quite weird because in 1998 we did not have Soviet Armenia anymore, but the magazine would go on and be published. And it was also the official body of Ginbajin. You could read that like on the very first page of the magazine. These actually visuals are from the very early issues of the magazine, from 1924 to I think 28. Okay, so briefly about the content. So this magazine had several content, quite different content. So I just chose the main ones because there were different, varying from issue to issue. So there was legislation, writing, and arts. I specifically brought it in different way because that's the area which I did my research. There was healthcare, literacy campaigns, postbox where women would write to magazines, say, oh, thank you for this, thank you for that, or just they would write like letters to their comrades from other countries. There was Our Sisters Abroad section, which was about different women from different countries. For example, there was lots of content about Chinese women, and they would like, the magazine would say, see, our Chinese sisters are doing this, doing that, we're like them, we're like this. Or they would have content about like UK, British women, and say, you know, we have these rights, but they don't have it yet, so see, we are up front, we're like more educated and we're forward. There was eradication of customs, a very specific section, which talked about how bad are actually Armenian traditions, because you would find Armenian traditions there. And also there was eradication of religion. You would find sometimes articles about, for example, how bad it is to believe in Saint Mary, or Christ was a liar, something like that. Very bold statements. And there were also feature stories about women who already succeeded. For example, there's a woman worker, he's a very good worker in the factory, there is a story about her, there's her picture, it's like, be like Bartusz, she's like, see, she's very educated, she's free, and this and that. All was very heavily propaganda material. So I chose fictional stories, and I chose the writing and art section because of several reasons. First of all, this was the only section which was published in all issues from 1924 to 1928 without any exceptions. So this section was present in all issues, which meant that it was most probably popular among the women. So fictional stories were written in the form of state propaganda, designed to heavily promote socialist values and socialist lifestyle. They touched upon the topic of harsh living conditions and inequality before the October Revolution. So it says, see, before this, these people were living so bad, and then October Revolution came and changed everything. And also all these stories praise the Bolshevik government for bringing equality to the classes and emancipating people. So women are central characters in most of the stories. Storylines revolve around the topics of illiteracy, religion, conservative tradition, family, its negative impact, specifically on women's rights, women's subordinate role within the family, and also they were narrated in different Armenian dialects, which was very funny to read, very difficult to read, and which made me think that these magazine editors were so smart because they knew that to appeal to average reader, they needed like a very special language. You could not appeal to a very poor, illiterate peasant woman who does not know much things, so who does not understand your, like, I don't know, propaganda language or very difficult Armenian words. So for you specifically, I put these very funny titles, as you can see. I translated some of them, just in case there are people who don't understand English. So the one says, Yugnachagaha Mulkens Nazon. Roughly translated, Mulkes Nazo is a community leader, the village head. So there's, you see, Bolshevik Sona, illiterate Almaz, another Bolshevik. So there's Sandika, which I really couldn't translate it in English, because when I put it in Google Translate, it was like a very funny translation. And then this is my favorite, this one. Let's go with the times, let's not fall behind the man. Or this one in Arachvana. There's also another funny one, which says, so basically, I don't need a mother-in-law if there is like a crash for my baby. So this was, I just gave this for you to understand what was the general kind of content and what was the general atmosphere in this magazine. As you can see, it's also, some scholars say that it was very low quality magazine. Also, they refer it to Rabotnitsa, the female worker, the Russian one, and the peasant worker, and the peasant woman, because it was specifically low quality, because they did not need, like, I don't know, to put Pushkin stories or Chekhov stories, or in the Armenian case, you would not see, like, for example, Hovannes Tumanyan in Hayastani Ashkhatabari, but you would see Khanko Alper. But Khanko Alper was, if I'm not mistaken, he was very much connected to the Soviet. I mean, he was living in Soviet Armenia, so he had to write stories in a very certain way that would fit the state propaganda. So, in all stories, the embracement of Bolshevik ideology by women and society is viewed as the only solution to addressing the problems inherited from the pre-Soviet society. So basically, what the stories taught women was that if you don't become a Bolshevik, you're going to be sad and miserable and unhappy like this, and you will continue being like that. So embrace Bolshevik ideology, become one of us, and you will be successful and happy. And you can see from the faces of these women I put all over the place. So how I did my research. So basically we have the content. So when I think analyzed around 105 stories and poems, which was a lot for doing it in 2 weeks. So what I did to understand how the gender construction process worked in the magazine, I categorized the types of representations I would see in the stories. So I would read the story and say, okay, this woman is hero woman, this one is emancipated, this is victim, this is backward. So I did not do this immediately, of course, but once I read, you see this character is repeating all the time. So okay, this character has specific characteristics, so this is this type, this one is that type. So I came up with these 4 types of characteristics, and then I tried to understand how these representations worked and how they constructed gender. So let's go briefly over the characteristics of this woman, and then I will talk about the gender construction processes. So who is the hero woman? She is exemplary Bolshevik woman. She is emancipated and free, like this woman. See, and she says, I think Stalin's something. She was literate, knowledgeable, fully aware of her legislative rights. She was courageous, unafraid of arguing with men. She was active in community, and most importantly, she encourages others. So these type of women in all the stories, they are already emancipated. They are already like an idol for other women, and they come to save basically the others. So storylines that revolve around this type of women. So usually they help a young girl to become literate, get involved in politics. They help a woman to file a case against their alcoholic husband, for example. They help to solve a community issue. They bring about change in the community. So the most interesting thing about this character is that she is not accepted in the beginning, because in the stories, for example, there are a group of men who say, oh, this is not a woman's place, she's such a bad woman, she should be doing her housework, she should be at home, what is she doing, this and that. Basically, she is facing these challenges from the community, but she's so heroic and she's so emancipated by the Bolsheviks that she basically doesn't care. And then, there is this very brilliant monologue of a Bolshevik girl in one of the stories, where she says, I'm a Bolshevik because I do not let them beat me like they would beat an animal. I'm a Bolshevik because I want to go to meetings, because my eyes have opened and I want to learn to read and write, and so on and so on. So the thing is that the idea this magazine tried to convey through this character is that you are only emancipated if you're a Bolshevik. There's no other way. See, she's listing all the challenges an average Armenian peasant woman might face, and she's saying, you know, I'm not like you because I'm a Bolshevik. This is an image from the magazine. It's one of the stories about a woman, a hero woman, let's say that. So she's basically, as you can see from the visuals as well, there's a gathering, a village gathering, and all the men are sitting. She's kind of like leading them, say, so I should say what's this and that, because I'm educated, you know, and I'm granted all the rights by the Bolshevik authorities to do this and that in the community. Another one is the victim woman. So the stories around victim woman are very, very sad, because she's always miserable from the very beginning till the end of the story. She's deprived of her rights, she's backward, she's illiterate, she's subjugated to her husband or her family. Most of the characters are subjugated to their mother-in-laws. So, and also she's depicted in embarrassing or tragic life scenarios. This is also an image from the magazine, one of the stories. So basically, the story is that this poor victim woman, she cannot conceive a child, and her mother-in-law decides that the best way is to use traditional methods. I don't know what she does with her there, but eventually she dies. So several stories represent young women who are forcibly married to other men and are unhappy. They tragically die, or they end up living an unhappy life. So nothing changes in their life from the beginning till the end of the story. So another archetype of this woman is that she experiences hardships and challenges due to her illiteracy and backwardness. The other one is that she, so there's a woman whose child is sick. She decides to take the child to the doctor because her emancipated Bolshevik neighbor suggests her. But on her way, she sees like this old backward woman who says, "Oh, why are you taking to doctors? They are not, they are liars. They cannot help you. You should take him to the church." And then she takes him to the church. The priest says several. Does a ceremony that says several prayers, but the child dies as a result, which like trying to show that church cannot save the baby. So the victim woman actually symbolizes the social defects of pre-Soviet society, and these archetypes represent the very value system that Bolshevism is seeking to eradicate completely. This is also an image from the magazine. So basically the story is that this is a young girl, basically a child, I think like 11 years old, and the dad says, "I do not let you to get an education, you should get married." So, and this is the image of the poor woman who died. And then we have the most popular type of woman, which I analyzed in the stories. So this is the emancipated or new Soviet woman. This is the type I explained, I represented in the very beginning. This is the type of woman Soviet society wanted for itself. So, as I said, this most popular category embodies the transformation of backward and illiterate woman into a knowledgeable and active socialist citizen. The thing is that I also analyzed is that this type of woman, she is not a character actually, she is a process, she's a transformation. And also, I want to mention that she is always victim in the beginning. So she is basically like the victim woman, but because of her choices, her clever choices to embrace the Bolshevik ideology, she's transformed and she's like happy, as you can see. So the new woman always faces challenges, sorry for my typos, and only finds solutions through the Bolshevik emancipation, as I said. So there's an example from a story. So illiterate woman Maro, who is bored of her household activities, decides to learn how to read and write to support her Bolshevik husband. Because her emancipated Bolshevik neighbor says, if you do not learn, read and write, and you not get emancipated, your husband will leave you. So she soon becomes literate and is elected as a deputy head of her village. So it shows, the story shows the process how you can become from a very illiterate person to become a head of the village. So another story is that illiterate and poor widow Almaz struggles to feed her children, and soon one of her children dies. She moves to the city with hopes, and then she finds Bolsheviks. They hire her to work, and then they educate her, and then she quickly learns how to read and write, and soon she's an emancipated socialist woman. And then at the end of the story, she goes back to her village and she educates the others. So exemplary character. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and then we have the backward woman, the angry one, as you can see in the picture. Usually midwives are depicted like this in the pages of Hayastani Ashkhatavarhi. So she's present in all stories, basically like an active member of society. She's old, she's illiterate, she's very traditional, and she's very conservative, she's very religious. The fact of being religious is always highlighted, and she's, of course, against any change because she thinks that Bolsheviks are fooling the young generation. So, okay, she believes that women's role is within the household and she should serve her husband and family. Backward women complain that Bolshevik ideology changed their daughters-in-law because they now speak back and argue with them, and instead of doing housework, they attend meetings and read books. That's very bad. And they also believe that God can heal various illnesses and urge young women to seek help in the church instead of visiting doctor, as I already introduced in the previous story. The thing is that with backward women, that this is the only character that is present in all the stories I analyzed, like in all 103 stories and poems, because this is, as I said, the type that Bolsheviks were trying to eradicate, to get rid of it. Okay, so now I will briefly talk about how this representation worked, how this gender construction, process of gender construction worked. Of course, for today's talk, I'm not going to bore you with theories and all the gender theories and all the Foucault and Stuart Hall theories, but to talk briefly about this. So this process, this construction of gender through Hayastani Ashkhatopuri worked basically through two ways. First, representation, and then identification. As we talked, representation was the four types of women. So these were representations that were constantly repeating. And then there was the process of identification. So as Stuart Hall notes, the meaning is produced by the practice and by the work of representation. So the work of representation were the four categories, and the practice is the process of identification. So basically, once these women read the stories, they were in the process of being absorbed in gender representation, the product of which was the new Soviet woman. So gender representation, as I said, happened through four categories, and it did two things here. So it created identification with characters to attract readers, and juxtaposed the hero woman, for example, with the backward woman and the victim woman, thus contrasting the image of the new Soviet woman with the miserable Armenian woman, and suggesting readers to make a choice. So it was not saying you should be like this, it was basically very smart, the stories, where they were suggesting women what to choose and what to become and what to have for their future. So why this identification process worked? Because all the characters are Armenian peasant women. Without any exception, they all are peasant women. This was also an interesting thing, because the magazine is called The Female Worker of Armenia, not the female peasant of Armenia. But all the women are peasant. They're either married, are about to marry, want to have children or have children, and they live in a very conservative and traditional environments. All stories begin with this. So all the protagonists mirror the experiences and life scenarios of ordinary readers. So basically, if you're a poor Armenian peasant woman, you read the story about Almas, you see, oh, she's like me. She also cannot feed her children. See, she cannot find work. She cannot this. Oh, she's just like me. So this was the identification process. And also, women are depicted in a domestic environment and are constantly engaged in housework, for example. Represented as patching their husband's clothes, cooking or cleaning. So they're always doing something, but that's not like teaching or participating in public meeting or this. And they're like also, they're within the Armenian traditional atmosphere. Also, so once this process of identification is done, so you read, you see, oh, she's like me, I'm like her. So the reader is exposed to solutions. That's the transformation into the new woman, or further the hero woman. Because first you transform into the new woman. You become literate, you become educated, you become an active member. And then if you want more, you can also become the hero woman and teach others, because the hero woman was like the highest category of the Soviet ideal. And also, the important thing is that basically the stories tell the women, you have a choice to make. Do you want to be a victim or embrace the Bolshevik ideology and be free? So that's like, you choose. And also, what's most important is that the harsh conditions, the victim woman is presented in such a bad way that you really do not want to be like her. And you see that there is a way to end your misery, and that there is a protagonist to guide you, because you see, oh, if Almas can be like this, she can guide me, I can be like that, I can take the same steps and become emancipated and become free and eventually be happy. This is it. And at the end, I put this famous quote by Lenin, who said, every female cook would be able to run a government. This was their idea for the Soviet Union. Eventually not, unfortunately, female cooks did not run the governments, because if they did, I think we would have a different society today. But I think that it's very important to examine and study this period of Armenia, because I think that its roots are still present in our society, and by understanding what happened in the 1920s, maybe we can be more effective in trying to eradicate some of the, I don't want to say old customs, because customs could be good and traditions could be good, but to eradicate some of the negative impact that's still present in our society, because as you saw in the stories, they are characters who are still present, like the backward women. We see a lot of them in Armenia, unfortunately. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer.
So questions for Armenia?
Armenia, can you tell us more about the when the magazine came back and lasted up until very recent?
Okay, so I did not have a chance to explore it in depth. I'm actually considering for doing it for a PhD. But when magazine drastically changed in 1930s when Stalin came to power, basically it mirrored the leaders of the times. When it came back, it was a drastically different magazine. So in 1958, the content was quite different. It was very high quality content compared to what was in 1920s, of course, because in 1958 you had a very literate society in Soviet Armenia. You had I cannot say, I mean, if women were fully emancipated, but you had a very developed society back in the 1960s. So the content was for a developed and very mature society back then. So you would not see this kind of stories there. And also, back in when it came back, there were also lots of feature stories about women from different spheres like science. Mostly, I think, from the content about worker women, like female workers, was more in 1950s. It eventually became the magazine Female Worker of Armenia. So yeah, it was quite different.
Thank you, Armenia, for your very interesting, very interesting talk. I was feeling proud, kind of. I have a question about the authors of these stories. Are they famous ones? Are they fictional writers? Or are they many women among these authors? And my second question, maybe I misunderstood. You talked about you had 2 weeks to do all this, or I misunderstood?
No, I had 2 weeks to read the stories, because I had 3 months to do my thesis. So yeah, 103 stories. Thank you for the question, because I wanted to talk about that and I forgot eventually. So the authors of these stories were mostly men, of course, and we had a couple of famous authors like Khângo Aber. We had, I think, also Bahram Alazan writing very heavily socialist, Leninist poems for the magazine, but there were also names of the authors. I think some of them I had were just like female names, like Asya, I don't know, Bartush, and you basically do not know who are these women. I assume that some of them were just average readers, because Hayastani Ashkhataburi, I think, as it went on, it started promoting its readers to write stories and send to them. So I don't know if these pseudonyms were real or they just men wrote these stories and presented them under the women's names. I cannot answer to that one, because also the names you see there are you cannot find an author like that, so it's impossible to know who are they. But my assumption is that, and I think I also mentioned that in my thesis, that it doesn't matter who wrote the stories, because they went to a very heavy editorial process to fit the state propaganda. So basically, yeah.
Is there an editor? I mean,
yeah, the magazine had an editor. I remember the second one. It's so bad I cannot remember the name of the first one. I remember the one from 1927 was Lucy Targul. She is not well known, but she is known writer. Some of her stories are very bad quality. I don't know why she was a well known writer. Actually, I forgot the name of the first. I'm so sorry. That's very bad. But the thing is that when in 1927, Zabel Yasan, when she was, I think, 28, when she was in Armenia, Soviet Armenia, she met with the editor. I'm going to remember her name. And then she wrote an article about Hayastani Ashkhataburi.
Flora Vartanya.
Yeah, thank you. Flora Vartanya. And Zabel Yasan wrote an article about Hayastani Ashkhataburi, and she said that this is such a great resource to emancipate our fellow Armenian women. So she liked the article. She was in the editorial. She met them, and she was very happy that this magazine was present in Armenia.
First off, thank you for the talk. My question is kind of a methodological one concerning the research. Do you, because at first you mentioned the policies of the Russian Bolsheviks, and then you went on talking about Armenians. Do you consider, like, how do you see the relations between the center and the margins of the Soviet Union? First, do you differentiate them, or do you think about early Bolsheviks in Armenia in the 20s? Second, I'm sorry, it's kind of has different parts, the question. Do you see drastic differences between the 20s the policies of the 20s and the 30s? And you mentioned the word propaganda a lot. How do you see what is propaganda, and does it have a real connection for you with the reality the Bolsheviks were trying to change?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So the thing is that for the scope of my research, I did not have the resources to kind of see and compare and look into the Soviet-Russian policies and actually how they were reflected in the margins, and also because of the lack of resources, because I was not physically in Armenia, so I could not go to the archives. So basically what I had was the magazines in my hand, and why I looked at the writing of this art section was mainly because I did not want to go deeper into the policy of legislation, because that's a completely different research and completely different sphere. And when looking into that, you have, of course, to compare with the Russian ones and how it was reflected in the margins. So my main focus was just the fiction, the literature that was presented in that in that magazine. The second question, yes, was about the differences, right? Unfortunately, no, I did not have the time to explore the differences in the 20s and in the 30s. I just had looked in a couple of articles and magazines from the 30s. It is quite different, I have to say. It is quite different, and it needs like a very thorough research. And as I said, this topic is very interesting and it needs to be researched. I know that there is research about it, there is not enough research. I know Irina, sitting next to you, she has an amazing chapter on Soviet Armenian gender policies. But what I did, as I said, I specifically concentrated on this section in this magazine. And for the propaganda, the image of the new Soviet woman, for me, that was a propaganda. That was, you should be like this. And I looked through that lens in my research.
What is propaganda for you? That's what my question is.
That's a very tough question to answer quickly. It's just like a certain way of life, certain way of behavior. You have to accept and you have to be like that. So something that's heavily, how to say that? I don't want to say ideology, some ideas, some way of thinking that you just have to force people to believe in, and you do it like massively, and you do it heavily. Like this magazine, for example, did. Like all the articles, all the stories were about the embracing the Bolshevik ideology. That's a propaganda. Thank you.
If I may, Kneja, first of all, thank you. Just joined a bit some 10 minutes later, but what I heard was really interesting. In terms of gender construction, I would be interested to know, or either in your future plans, if you have researched a bit, what was how men were depicted there, right, in terms of gender. So we saw how gender construction worked for women. That would be interesting to see how men also, so that also to compare and to see how gender construction in total worked in the society, right?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, because the way men were depicted in the stories are quite different. For example, if in terms of women, I could identify, for example, just for this research, these 4 categories, men are like quite depicted in a quite different way. There are some men who are represented as emancipators. There are some men who are represented as backward women. There are some men who go through transformation. For example, they believe that women should be within her house, and then they see, oh, but you know what? No, they should run the government, for example. But generally, if I very generally say, from what I've seen and in the stories is that men are depicted, better is not a good word, in a more nicer way than women. So women is always subordinate to men in a way. So they're like, even there's equality, but you know, men are better. That was the idea I got from the stories.
Some animals are more.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Akhenaten, on the work and on your homecoming. I was wondering if you've come across how, first of all, the newspaper was disseminated, especially in the furthest parts of Armenia, in the rural communities, and also how it was perceived by the public, the general public opinion, especially among women.
Yes, thank you. This is a question that interested me a lot because basically I was speculating my research because I cannot know if these women read these stories or they like. This was just how this was done. I know that it was not published. I think 1,000 issues or 3,000. It depends the year and the issue on the year and the issue. But how it was perceived. I mean, I cannot say because based on the reviews that were in the magazine, you don't know if these were real women or if they were written by the editors. You know, in terms of that, I think there needs to be like a good archival research from the Ginvaji's documents, if there is any.
Thank you.
I have two questions. The first one, considering that the number of illiterate population in the 20s in Armenia was quite high, especially I think among the female population. Was there something in parallel, like a radio broadcast, because writing about women should be illiterate to women who could read it to a smaller crowd? And the second one, I don't know if it was intentional, but 4 out of the 5 names were Armenian women names. Have you seen a pattern, or not? Or was it like the Armenian feminist ideology of Constantinople, an Armenian version of Lenin's Bolshevik women, or not?
Let me start with that question. It was quite different from what Armenian women in the late 19th century would want for Armenian women, the Soviet Armenian women. There were, of course, similarities because it was all about emancipation and granting women equal rights and having them to participate in the community activities. But the thing is that the intention was different. For the Soviet state, they needed these women because they needed mass production, they needed to reproduce their society and keep their society. But for the Armenian women of the late 19th century, they wanted this emancipation for their nation. They wanted this emancipation for the women of their nation and not for them to become basically state subjects. And what was the first question? Yeah, the radio. So yes, that's a very good question. So many women were illiterate, and the thing is that I also saw that in the pages of the magazine that it says there were special peasant huts, where women would go and study, and there would be other women who would read for them until they become literate. So this was a very common practice, I can assume, from what I read in the magazine. And regarding radio, I think there was radio in the 1920s in Armenia. I believe so, yes. But I don't know how it was engaged in disseminating women's emancipation and ideas.
I have maybe 2 questions. Maybe you mentioned it, but I was a bit late. Was it free or no?
The newspaper, it was very cheap. A few cents, I think. And also, there was a practice that one would gather one magazine issue and then she would disseminate it to her fellow neighbors or her villagers. So they could get like one copy for one village and like many women would read it.
And was there any advertisements in those newspapers?
Not in the early times, no. But there were later, but not in the 20s.
How many copies?
I think it was different. So one was, for example, I remember like 1,000. There was another one, 3,000. Maybe it also depended on how much they had the ability to print, the resources to print. But in the 50s and 60s, it was a lot, like 10,000, 20,000.
If I may add to that, initially it started with 500 copies, and the magazine bragged 5 years later that their readership has reached to 7,000, because I looked into the older versions of these issues of this magazine, so it reached up to 7,000, which also is perhaps an answer to Shahid's question that yes,
The rate was,
women were getting literate in a hurry for all these purchase things that you mentioned, and in the cities they had these libraries, reading halls.
Armenia, thank you so much for being here. This is a kind of dress rehearsal for Armenia, because she's going to be presenting at the UCLA Graduate Student Conference this weekend. She's going to be presenting her research. We're really excited for that. We'll have an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit with her, and please keep an eye out for our next monthly forum. It's going to be very exciting. We're looking forward to seeing some of the folks who are sitting in this room present in the coming months, and we hope to see you there. Please enjoy some wine, continue to talk to Armenia, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much.